everybody. I'm Natasha Kirchuk, and thanks for joining us for ILTV's weekly program One-on-One with Alan Dershowitz. We want to give you, our viewers, a chance to have your questions answered by Professor Dershowitz, one of America's greatest legal minds. He's a leading expert on criminal and constitutional law, civil liberties, and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Hi, Professor Dershowitz. It's so great to have you.
It's great to be back. Thank you.
All right, so let's get started. Today's show, Professor, is a special edition of our program. We're calling it Literally Alan, and we want to give our viewers a taste of your literary talents, reflected in the over 35 books that you've written, from advocacy books that make the case for Israel to legal textbooks to works on Jewish thought. You have provided the world with more than enough literary masterpieces. So let me catch my breath before our first guest. Professor, as you know, every week we open our show with a special guest. Today we're honored to have former Israel Air Force commander and former president of El Al Airlines, Major General Eliezer Shkedi.
Professor Dershowitz, shalom.
So,
From the moment I met you, I realized that you are a big fighter for the state of Israel and for the Jewish nation. I think that the book that you wrote, The Case for Israel, is a unique book and very, very important book, analyzing very loud and very clear the most important issues related to the state of Israel and the Jewish nation. This is the reason I decided to give it to my people in the Air Force and to my people in El Al. I would like to ask you, Professor Dershowitz, if you had to write this book today, what would you change and what would you add? Thank you.
thank you so much. General Shkedi, you're one of Israel's greatest heroes, not only militarily, obviously as the head of the Air Force, you protected Israel against enemies, both terrorist enemies and existential enemies. You also protected Israel against false charges of war crimes. When you were the head of the Air Force, you very significantly reduced the number of collateral casualties when attacking legitimate terrorist targets. As the head of El Al, you became a great kind of diplomatic spokesman for Israel. You are also a great friend and a great humanitarian and a great human being. Israel is proud of you, and justly so. Thank you so much for making my book, The Case for Israel, available. You're also something of a prophet, because you said to me, if I had to write it over again, what would I change? Well, in fact, I am writing it over again. I'm writing a new case for Israel. I'm trying to bring the case that's 16 years old now or something like that up to date. I will add a great deal more about the threats from Iran, the threats from ISIS. I will add the BDS movement and all the threats that Israel currently faces, some of which were just changes in threats they already faced in the past. Some of them are relatively new threats. I will try to deal with every issue that Israel confronts today. Indeed, over the past decade and a half since the publication of The Case for Israel, the book's been translated into several languages, and in each case I've written introductions that have updated the book and made it relevant to the places where the books were being published in different languages. And so now I plan in the next year to create an updated version, a version that brings the reader all of the new information that has occurred since the time of the publication. I want to see it remain a viable book. I also want to make sure it's an ebook and a book that can be available on social network so that students can take parts of it and use it to defend Israel on college campuses and other places where Israel is unjustly attacked. So thank you again, General Shkedi, for your great contribution to Israel, to human rights, to flying, and to menschlichkeit. You are a real mensch. Thank you.
Well, let me know when I can get my hands on this new version of the book, and also hopefully you'll translate it to Hebrew, just like your first version of the book. So
well,
it's really...
as you know, Danny Grossman was responsible for taking the book and having it translated into Hebrew, because he realized that although many in America think every Israeli understands the case for Israel, it's not always the situation, and that many Israelis need to be educated on how to make the most effective case for Israel. And by the way, I don't make the case for every single Israeli policy. I make what I call the 80% case, the case that involves consensus, what most Israelis agree to, and I leave it up to Israelis and others to fight about the remaining 20% that you're going to always find disagreement about.
Of course. Well, I mean, I think everybody that lives in this country needs something like that in their hands, especially when they travel abroad and they're trying to explain where they come from and you know, the face of their country. So now I have a question for you. The U.S. elections just took place this month, and one of the many concerns for Clinton supporters was a preliminary count showing that Hillary actually won the popular vote. In your book, Electoral Dysfunction, you discuss the role of the Electoral College in the elections. And in your opinion, is the Electoral College good for American voters and more specifically Jewish voters?
Well, it's a very, very good question. And as you know, the election, like the election of 2000, was essentially a tie. According to preliminary votes, Hillary Clinton won a very, very tiny popular majority and then lost in the Electoral College because the way the Electoral College votes, it really depends on 7 or 8 battleground states. The Electoral College is a throwback to the slavery situation in the United States. The compromise that was struck when the Constitution was written was designed to give the southern states, which were less populous, more influence in the selection of the president. So they had the despicable 3/5 clause where black slaves counted as 3/5 of a human being for a vote, although they themselves were not entitled to vote. And the Electoral College is what allowed some of the southern politicians to be elected president of the United States. It's an anachronism in some ways, but on the other hand, it does give power to certain states that would otherwise not have power, smaller states. It actually disempowers in many ways Jewish voters because Jewish voters tend to be in very large states like New York and California, which nobody campaigns in because they're locked in for the Democrats. Jewish voters also vote in Florida, which is a key battleground state under the Electoral College, and so there has to be an appeal to Jewish voters. Also, Jewish voters vote in significant numbers in Philadelphia and Ohio. So from the point of view of Jewish empowerment, I would say it's hard to know what the electoral outcome would be. By the way, also, you know, you can't just say that Hillary Clinton would have won the election had it been a popular vote. We don't know, because campaigns would have been different. There would have been much more campaigning in places like New York and California. So therefore, she might have won an even more, a greater majority of voters if there hadn't been an electoral college. We just don't know. But the rules are the rules. The Constitution sets out the electoral college, and sometimes we benefit from it, sometimes we don't benefit from it. But until and unless the Constitution is changed, and it won't be changed because you'd need a constitutional amendment, we are stuck with the electoral college for better or worse.
Well, I guess next time you're going to have to answer what you want, whether you think there should be an electoral college or not, but we can wait till our next show. All right, Professor, now let's hear some questions from our viewers. Daniel Michelson is a student from California who will be starting law school next year, and he wants to ask you about your book, Letters to a Young Lawyer.
Hi, Professor Dershowitz. My name is Daniel Michelson, and I'm finishing my last year at Tel Aviv University before I attend law school next year. And I read your book, Letters to a Young Lawyer, and I noticed that you have some very influential people that you had throughout your life that might have been directing you to take a certain legal path, and you didn't necessarily follow what they had for you. I was wondering what advice you might have for someone who is starting their legal career now in the 21st century that you might have not known in 2001 when you published the book.
Well, Daniel, thank you so much, and good luck on law school. The world needs great lawyers, lawyers who are prepared to defend the underdogs, to defend the poor, to level the playing field. I start out my advice book, yet Letters to a Young Lawyer, by saying that I rarely took advice, and that often advice is just people telling you how to live their lives the way they live their lives. So be cautious about taking advice. So I'm not going to give you any personal advice. I'm going to make a couple of points that I think are relevant that I did not make in my book, The Letters to a Young Lawyer, which was written some years ago. Number one, the new way of practicing law is global. National boundaries don't recognize some of the most important aspects of modern day life. National boundaries don't recognize the internet. They don't recognize terrorism. They don't recognize the environment. They don't recognize many of the most important health issues. They don't recognize many of the most important businesses. So learn to be a global lawyer. Don't leave your practice local, particularly as somebody who has been in Israel and the United States. There are great opportunities for lawyers to do transnational business between Israel and the United States. I'm privileged to have a number of great Israeli clients who I've represented over the years in situations where there's been transnational concerns, where the issues transcend national boundaries. So I think becoming a global lawyer is crucially important. The other bit of advice, which I really do say in my book, but I want to reemphasize, is don't necessarily do what you're best at. I know people who have done things that they know they're superb at, but they don't get such an enjoyment out of it. I think you have to get up every morning wanting to go to work. You can never say, thank God it's Friday, except if you think about Friday as Erev Shabbat and you want to welcome Shabbat. That's a fine thing to do. But don't think of hoping for the end of the work week. I mean, I get up every morning on Monday morning saying, thank God it's Monday. In Israel, it would be, thank God it's Sunday. Because I like my work. I like thinking about every morning what exciting thing I'm going to be doing today. So find something that you have great excitement from. Don't think of work as just a way of making a living. Work takes up most of your life in some ways. And so make sure you find a niche that serves your own interest. But I do think thinking globally, learning several languages, figuring out what the future is going to look like instead of what the past looked like. The law is a big focus on precedent on the past. Don't get locked into that. Think about what it will be like to practice law 50 years from now, and good luck on your practice of law.
Well, that's a lot of advice that I could use myself, even though you say we shouldn't be taking advice, Professor Dershowitz. All right, so far we've discussed your famous advocacy book, The Case for Israel, and a popular legal book that you geared towards students and the general public. Now, let's turn to Ida Teitelbaum, who has a question about one of your novels.
Hi, Professor Dershowitz. My name is Ida. I'm 25 years old and I'm from Russia. I just read your amazing novel called Just Revenge. The main character is a Holocaust survivor named Max, who by accident many years later stumbles across the ex-Nazi who killed his whole family in Europe. The story then turns into Max's attempt to seek justice and revenge. What I loved about the book more than the courtroom drama is the way you raised the hardest questions about morality and the law. Can you talk a little bit about the book? And do you enjoy writing fiction? Thank you.
Ida, thank you so much. What a great question. I really love it. Writing fiction is very hard for me. Writing nonfiction is very easy because I'm used to writing briefs, which hopefully are nonfiction. Sometimes my opponents accuse them of being fiction. But novels are very hard because you have to structure them and you have to take reality and turn it into something that is literary. Just Revenge for me was a thrill to write because it was really about my own feelings of justice and revenge for the Holocaust, which I think was insufficiently punished. Too many hands-on Nazi murderers lived good lives and died in the bed surrounded by their loving grandchildren. We did not get justice for the murder of 6 million babies and children and law-abiding civilians. And so in all my novels, I try to raise hard moral questions, and the reviews have picked it up. The New York Times review of Just Revenge said the main characters are not the people, but the issues of morality and justice that run through the book. One of the reviewers said it was like a law school hypothetical exam. My first novel, The Advocate's Devil, also poses impossible dilemmas of what a lawyer should do when faced with choices of evils or difficulties. And my third novel, The Trials of Zion, which probably is going to be my last novel, I find it a little too hard to write novels, dealt with Israel's existential threat and terrorism and the Iranian threat. So novels are a good way to get to very difficult and complex moral issues and to try to personalize them. and very hard to write. And I have tremendous admiration for novelists. I love the writings of Philip Roth. I wish he would get the Nobel Prize. I love the writings of Amos Oz. I wish he'd get the Nobel Prize. His book about his mother's suicide, which was just made into a movie by my former student, Natalie Portman, is both a great book and a great movie. Saul Bellow was one of my favorite writers, Dostoevsky, of course, Shakespeare. I used to teach a class on Shakespeare and the law. So I love literature. I think that to be a successful person in the world, you have to be steeped in the world's literature, including, by the way, the Bible, which is one of the greatest literary works ever composed. I just think that novels are a way of getting at a truth differently than nonfiction. So thank you, Ida, so much for your wonderful question and for giving me an opportunity to reflect on my book, Just Revenge.
Beautiful. All right, Professor, I'd like to get a little more personal, if you don't mind. One of the main characters in Just Revenge is a lawyer named Abe Ringel. He acts and talks pretty much like you, and you even mentioned that he was kind of a reflection of yourself. Is he your alter ego? And if so, where did you get his name from?
Well, my mother's maiden name is Ringel. My name is Avraham. So Abe Ringel was a natural way of putting together myself and my mother's maiden name. He's in some ways an alter ego, but he's better than me and a very good person. And the hero of almost all of the three books is his young daughter, Emma, who obviously is based on my young daughter, Ella. And the three novels reflect three different stages in my daughter's development. She's now 26 years old, but I wrote my first novel when she was a teenager, and she becomes the hero of that book. And in Trials of Zion, she's kidnapped by Palestinian terrorists and held for ransom that would result in her being freed only if her lawyer father won the case in the Israeli courts on behalf of an accused terrorist. So it poses all kinds of great dilemmas. And sure, Abe Ringel is based on my life, but whenever you write a fictional character, you try to improve yourself a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I understand that the picture on the cover of the book also has personal meaning for you, right?
Right. The picture on the cover of Just Revenge is my family just on the eve of the Shoah, and that's a wedding in Poland in 1938. And tragically, only one person in that picture had the foresight to moved to Palestine and was saved, and now has wonderful children and grandchildren who live in Israel. One of his grandchildren is the head of the Department of Pharmacology at Hebrew University, and great family in Israel. But the rest of them were all murdered in cold blood by Nazi killers during the Holocaust. I recently went back to the places where my family lived in Poland and tried to find traces, and discovered that I had a 16-year-old cousin who was a beautiful woman who was taken as a sex slave by the Nazis and then murdered in cold blood. And her brother was an assistant to the commandant at Auschwitz, and he was also hanged. So you learn the tragedy of your family. And that's why I think if somebody asked me what my favorite book was of my 35 books, I would have to say Just Revenge is probably my favorite book.
Wow. So for all of our Hebrew speakers who would like to read this book, there's actually a Hebrew version. You can buy it online. I'm looking at it on my phone. Nekamat Tzodeket is the Hebrew name of Just Revenge. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks so much for your time, Professor Dershowitz. And I also want to thank all of our guests, especially Major General Reserve Eliezer Shkedi. Now, if you'd like Professor Dershowitz to answer your questions, go to iltv.tv or our Facebook page and submit them. We'll see you again next week.